Hello everyone, and welcome to my plenary session. It's such an honor to be asked to present at the Mathematics Education and Society Conference in 2021. I was so looking forward to having a face-to-face presentation, but of course, the context of our current world has decided otherwise. So here I am giving you a virtual presentation. Okay, my name is Anthony Essien. I prefer to be called simply Tony. I'm from the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. And my presentation is on exemplification in teacher education, more specifically exemplification in the teaching and learning of mathematics in pre-service teacher education. So for my presentation, I'm going to first of all talk about the context of the problem, and then I'll talk about my own personal story, and then my quest that gave rise, of course, to my quest for an all-encompassing framework for examining exemplifying practices in mathematics teacher education classrooms. And then, of course, I'll give you my triadic framework for understanding examples in multilingual teacher education classroom. And I'll show a brief example of how I used that example and then conclude and make recommendations. Okay, so the problem. So as we all know, South Africa is a very multilingual society or country, like many other countries in the world now. And I know there was a paper I read some time ago that says, show me a classroom that is not multilingual. So multilingualism is becoming a norm, not just in South Africa, elsewhere in the world. And the teaching and learning of mathematics in such a context has been deemed to be complex. Okay, and someone like Bowell talks about this complexity in three ways. He talks about the triple challenges of teaching and learning in multilingual classroom. Attention needs to be paid to the mathematics itself. Attention needs to be paid to the language in which the mathematics is embedded. And attention needs to be paid to the mathematical language itself, the mathematical language, the mathematics register, and so on. And so for us in South Africa, one of our greatest challenges, as Young would put it, is how to prepare pre-service teachers to deal with the complexity of teaching mathematics in multilingual classrooms at the end of their qualification. So, and research in this respect in South Africa has mainly focused on language practices, the language practices that you can see in classrooms, and not directly in teacher education as such, or I mean in mathematics teacher education as such, and how to prepare teachers to teach mathematics to multilingual learners. So when I talk about the research in South Africa being mainly focused on language practices, I'm thinking here of the pioneering work done by Jill Adler and Mamokgeti Pakeng. But it still remains a fact that attention still needs to be paid to how pre-service teachers are trained to go out there at the end of their qualification to teach mathematics in multilingual classrooms. I particularly like this citation or quotation by Mayer, and if you permit me, I would like to read it. Learning to teach for the pre-service teachers involves the interplay of teaching role and teaching identity. Learning to teach can be learning the skills and knowledge to perform the functions of a teacher, or it can be developing a sense of self as teacher. In the former, one is being the teacher, whereas in the latter, one is becoming a teacher. And then Mayer goes on to say that these distinctions have significant implications for the design and the conduct of pre-service teacher education programs. And me being a pre-service, a teacher educator myself, I take this very seriously. So in my previous research, where I looked at how pre-service teachers are prepared to teach mathematics in multilingual context, I used Wenger's theory to examine the different dimensions that's involved in teacher education. So I used communities of practice framework. But that particular study sensitized me to the multidimensional layers in teacher education. So, and these layers include the teaching of mathematics, the teaching of mathematics in multilingual contexts, which was the context in which my study was embedded, the learning of mathematics content, the learning of mathematical practices, and the development of proficiency in the language of teaching and learning. I'll return to this in subsequent slides. So as a teacher educator myself, I had to think of what dimensions I was kind of enculturating in my pre-service teachers. And when I look at even my research, which involved some universities in South Africa, and my own practice, I realized that something was missing. So it was easy to pay attention to the content, and it was easy also to pay attention to the learners, to the learning of mathematics content, to the teaching of mathematics. But what became prominent for me was the lack of attention that is paid to the mathematical practices aspect. So we do give examples in class. Okay, let's use definition. We give definitions in class. How do you define this? What is a fraction? We ask our learners to define, we ask our students to define different mathematical concepts. But so that is like paying attention to the content, in fact, because defining is a content. But then what about what makes for a good definition? How do we get our students to understand what makes for a good defining practice? That is what I mean by paying attention to the mathematical practice. We give our students examples. In my class, when I ask students to present some work for me, they use examples, questions in mathematics to present the examples. And then I ask, what principle guided you in the choice of the set of examples you've chosen to teach us today? And they'll be stuck. They'll look at me. They don't understand that you need to think about a certain principle in mind when you are choosing examples. You cannot just choose examples randomly. So it is important that attention is paid to what makes for a good choice of example. So that is how I gradually started looking at something like exemplifying as a practice in teacher education. Okay, so for me, the choice of exemplification was because of the importance and the centrality of examples that's used in the teaching and learning of mathematics. Any mathematics class will have some examples, some tasks, some questions in mathematics that we want our students or learners to solve. Okay, in my larger study, then I delved deeper into this, and I looked at exemplifying practices within multilingual pre-service teacher education. And to do that, I'm looking at the use of examples and how they impact on the teaching and learning of mathematics in multilingual classrooms. And again, the whole point of what constitutes a good, if you keep looking at it, I have put it in parentheses, a good example or a good example space on different topics within pre-service education classrooms. Then I'm also looking at how mathematics, how to interweave language and mathematics learning opportunities into what I do in the class. So that is because when I think of examples, I can think of examples in two different ways. The first is that examples are chosen. You have to choose the examples you use. Okay, you choose the examples you use, but the choice, as I will explain again later, is not enough. The usage is also vital. So in terms of the choice, what comes to the fore is the fact that in looking at the literature around the examples, analysis of examples in mathematics teaching and learning, the framework, and some people say you must call it a principle, okay, the framework or theory that comes to mind almost immediately is variation theory, because it is ubiquitous in every respect. And so I decided to look at that framework to think about how I can use that to guide me in what I do in my pre-service teacher education classrooms. But I realized that then the choice of examples is just having the choice of choosing examples is not enough. I need to also engage with the use of these examples. So how are these examples used? What other examples are generated in practice and all that? So that became for me important. And to be able to provide a lens into the usage of examples, I decided to bring in two other frameworks, and one of them being Mortimer and Scott's framework on dialogue. So teaching and learning as a dialogic process. And then the second framework is the multifarious dimensions involved in teacher education that I will explain later. First, let me quickly talk about variation theory. I won't spend too much time on variation theory. I think I spent an extensive time in my paper trying to talk about variation theory, except then to say that I particularly like how Low and Chick summarized variation theory. They say that variation theory holds that the necessary conditions for learning include focusing on the object of learning. So at the center of this is the object of learning. Oh my God, okay. The object of learning. So, and then looking at the different ways in which the critical features of the object of learning, and also then devising examples kind of or patterns of variations within the examples that will kind of bring out the object of learning. So let's look at a very quick example. In this example, we can see a question given to the early graders. When we look at this example very carefully, we can see that there is 7 all round here, and there is 9 all around there. There is subtraction sign everywhere, and then there is a placeholder everywhere too. And so we can begin to say, okay, just looking at the example in and of themselves, what do these examples, what are these examples of? Okay, without knowing what the object of learning is, that's originally in the mind of the person who chose this example, someone can say, well, it is about the concept of nineness, because I see 9 there. Another person can say it's about the concept of sevenness, because I see 7 there. And then another person could say, well, maybe it is teaching the learners subtraction. Okay, so it could be about subtraction. But then some other person can say, well, it could be about the equal sign, in which case this would be a very, very poor example. So examples, as Kohlberg argues, examples, even when well chosen, are insufficient in themselves in enabling learning. So with that in mind, the way the teacher teaches this could make this a subtraction kind of a task, or it could make it a different kind of task, and the learners could view it as something different from what the teacher had in mind. All depends on how the teacher teaches this. So the enactment process is quite important. Okay, so then bearing that in mind, I decided to ask then for myself, what does it mean to use variation theory in multilingual classrooms? And how can variation theory be used in multilingual teacher education classrooms so that it accounts for this complexity involved in preparing pre-service teachers or teachers for teaching in multilingual classroom. So in thinking of that, what came to mind was the words of Lester, who argues that rather than adhering to one particular theoretical perspective, in which case this would now be variation theory and trying to see how variation theory can help. So he argues that rather than adhering to one particular perspective, we can act as bricoleurs by adapting ideas from a range of theoretical sources to suit our goals. And that is exactly what I tried to do, to bricolage variation theory. And by doing so, I brought in two other frameworks, and I'll get to that now. But in this particular slide, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in bringing together the different sources, the different frameworks, okay, I had to bear in mind that the examples in themselves are not important, but also how they are used is also important. Okay, so then because I'm dealing with a situation where I'm dealing with multilingual learners, I have to think about the language discourse. So what discourse is being used? Okay, how language is being used to engage with the examples is also important for me. And then, of course, how through the use of these different through the use of the examples and different identities are constructed or co-constructed in practice within the teacher education classrooms. Okay, so the first framework, as I indicated, is Mortimer and Scott's framework of meaning making as a dialogic process. I'll very quickly go through it. I'll go through what the key tenets of the framework. So Mortimer and Scott argue that meaning making can be seen as a fundamental dialogic process where ideas are brought together and worked upon, and how the teacher orchestrates the talk is important in all this. So they have these 5 aspects of the framework, which talks to teaching purposes, content, communicative approach, patterns of discourse, and teacher intervention. I'll focus a bit more on the approach 1, which is the communicative approach. The pattern of discourse is basically, is it IRF or what they call IRP, P for prompt, or is it IRP, RP, RP, okay, and so on and so forth. It's all there in the paper, please. But looking at the communicative approach, I would like to get to this diagram. See, I'm running out of time very quickly. So Mortimer and Scott argue that talk can be analyzed based on whether they are dialogic or authoritative. Okay, if they are dialogic discourse is simply about bringing in a range of ideas or viewpoints and explaining that and engaging with that in class, while authoritative dimension is focusing on one viewpoint, mainly the teacher's viewpoint. Okay, so I need to say this, for Mortimer and Scott, dialogue is not a function of how many people are involved in the interaction or process. It is more a function of how many ideas are brought into focus when even one person is talking. So if I bring in a range of ideas when talking about one particular thing, then that is dialogue, even if I am presenting to you as I am right now. So I'm bringing in a range of ideas as I explain something, okay, a range of opinions and engaging with the opinion. Even if I'm doing it myself, then it is dialogic. Okay, authoritative is if I focus on one, the scientific point of view only, and stop there. Where you bring in people will be where you then talk about the interactive and the non-interactive aspect. So these two are also in their own continuum, as you can see there. So then when you put these two together, you come up with these four different dimensions. And the first being the interactive dialogic. So that will mean a situation where there is a lot of viewpoints are brought in and people are involved. Both the teacher and the learners are involved. And in this other quadrant, you have the interactive authoritative. So the class is very interactive. Everyone is talking, a lot of people are talking, but there is a focus. There's a one viewpoint is what is being adhered to or being taken by the teacher. Okay, so it could be a situation where even when a learner tries to ask the teacher to look at a different perspective of things, a different solution process, the teacher says, no, this is how it is done, and that's final. Okay, so this other quadrant is when it is non-interactive and authoritative. This is like a lecture style thing where you just simply present one point of view in a lecture style mode. Okay, and then non-interactive and dialogic will be a situation where I bring in different viewpoints, different perspectives, but then I don't involve others. Okay, so that's in summary meaning making as a dialogic process. And what about the other framework? The other framework is very specific to teacher education. As I said, there are multi-dimensional layers in teacher education, and these multi-dimensional layers are actually from the work of Wenger, when Wenger talks about identity as a constant becoming, identity as a constant becoming. And so when we look at that in terms of teacher education, okay, we then look at it in terms of 5 interacting identities, which I call, which are, the first is we are training teachers to become teachers of mathematics, but they are also becoming teachers of mathematics in multilingual classrooms. They are becoming learners of the content of mathematics, and they are becoming learners of mathematical practices and becoming proficient users of language for the purpose of teaching. So proficient users of the language of teaching and learning. Okay, so now I had to put these 3 frameworks into one. I had to merge this framework. And so here now, the major framework is what I'm calling the triadic framework for understanding examples in mathematics, teacher education, multilingual classrooms. Okay, I argue that it provides a multifocal conceptual lens for the exploration of the 3 critical layers involved in the complexity or in teaching, in preparing pre-service teachers or preparing teachers for teaching mathematics in multilingual classrooms. The first to be that it attends to the object of learning. It attends to the object of learning. And the second is that it attends also to the interactional process that takes place, right, in the course of the enactment of the object of learning. And then the last one is that it attends also to the multidimensional layers that are involved in teacher education. So that is that it engages with how these are either brought or not brought to focus. So the all-encompassing framework is shown here, and I would just need to explain a couple of things there. I have put these up here for a particular reason, and that is because as I will explain in my next slide, I just realized that if I move to my next slide, I can't move back again, so I'm not going to move from this slide right away. So when you look at this, I've put up there for a particular reason, and that is simply because when you think of this, a question can be, a set of examples can be analyzed in two different ways. The first one is this. I can look at the examples, two different levels rather. In the first instance, the set of examples can be analyzed solely on the basis of mapping the examples in and of themselves to variation theory. So I have the examples, I map them to variation theory, and in mapping them to variation theory, I think about the examples in terms of the critical features and in terms of the patterns of variation. That is when there's just looking at the example in and of themselves. But then there is a second layer to it. And the second layer is about the interactional process. So that's when this arrow goes straight. The first layer is when this arrow goes straight like this and back. Okay, the second layer goes up here and comes there in terms of my analysis, goes up there and there. Okay, so there is attention paid to the interactional process that is used in the enactment process of the examples. And this is when the examples are used in class. So you are able to analyze the interactional process, okay, in the class. And through the analysis and through the use of the examples and the interactional processes and all that, we then can see how the different layers involved in teacher education are either attended to or not. And that is why we have this here pointing to these different layers, multidimensional layers in teacher education. So basically, what I've just explained to you using the other diagram is what I have here in this particular slide. So I'm just going to skip it, and then we look at an example of that was used in class. Okay, when we look at this example, this is an example that was actually used in a class where I was, and it was an introductory class on probability, and the pre-service teachers were actually meeting probability for the first time because they never had the opportunity of doing probability in high school. In those days, probability was not part of the high school curriculum in South Africa. Okay, so the first example is the chances of the teacher educator coming to class in the subsequent class. So she says, what is the probability that I'll be in class in the next class? So that was the first question. The second question was about tossing the coin. And the game of football was used where a coin is tossed before the different captains. The captains choose sides. So that was the first. The third was throwing a dice, and then the fourth was a pack of cards. So thinking about my framework, we can analyze this at two levels. The first level, remember, is thinking of it only on the basis of variation theory. On the basis of variation, mapping the examples to variation theory. So in doing that, we look at the critical features and the pattern of discourse. We look at variance and invariance and all that. So what is the same, what is different, and what opportunities are there for generality and fusion and all that. So when we look at this, and I'll try to be brief in that, and saying this. Okay, so when we look at the first one, the probability, the chance of the teacher educator coming to class, there are two possibilities there. Okay, he's either in class or not in class. So and then in example 2 also, there are two possibilities. So there's something similar between example 1 and example 2. Okay, I didn't mention that what is similar across everything is the fact that the everyday is brought into the picture in all these 4 examples. Okay, because even this was actually a practical one where a dice was brought into class and all that. So thinking of the first two examples, so there are 2 possibilities here, 2 outcomes here, 2 outcomes here, there. Here, of course, there are 6. Okay, throwing a dice, and here there are 52 possibilities. Okay, so there's something similar and there's something different even in the possibility. So what is different in example 3 is that then it's no more 2 but 6, and then here is 52. Okay, so there's variance and there's invariance, but there's also some invariance and variance at other levels. When we think of example 1, so the teacher educator can either be either or. So either or is an important concept here now. So he's either in class or not in class. In example 2, I'm just going to take these first 2 examples and deal with it. In another paper that I wrote for ZDM, I'll talk about it very quickly at the end. In another paper I wrote about ZDM, I did an analysis of throwing a dice, so you might want to take a look at that paper. So going back to the first 2 examples, when we think of these 2 examples, we can see that we can see some similar things, and the 2 are dealing with an either or situation. The teacher educator is either in class or not in class, okay, unless he's got the gift of bilocation, which I was very much sure he didn't. Okay, so then in the second example, one captain either gets ahead or doesn't. So there is either or there. But then the solution to these 2 questions vary. Okay, and then that's what creates the variance in the two examples. So in the first example, we have a situation of either or, where in one case, okay, there are 2 possibilities here. If we're looking at theoretical probability, it is either 1 or 0. So he's either present or not present. Okay, but if we look more at relative probability, where we can say, well, it depends. It depends on whether or not he is good at coming to class. If he's always good at coming to class, then the probability will shift towards 1. If he's very good at bunking lectures, then the probability will shift towards 0. So, okay, and so that is the first one. In the second one, the probability of a captain, one of the captains getting ahead, is half. Is half. It's not 1 or 0. So this lends to something about generality when it comes to the situation of either or for learners, for the students. So they need to also understand that a situation of either or does not necessarily warrant the answer of 1 or 0. Okay, it could also be some other thing, and that is the generality that can be drawn. So the question then is, in the enactment process of these examples, how was this attended to? How was this particular aspect of generality within the example attended to? So I have here the transcript that, and I think I'll read through very quick. Okay, I don't have time to read through, but since it is recorded, you can spend time looking at it. And you can pause the video and read it through, and then I'll project the next one, and we can pause to your video. You can pause the video too and read through the examples. I have only 6 more minutes. Okay. So when we look at this transcript, so what is evident in the transcript is that there is interactional authoritative approach that lends its way to the IR initiation response prompt and so on pattern of interaction, but that converges in the teacher educator's viewpoint, and that's why it is in fact interactive authoritative, because it converges. It is interactive, but it's also authoritative. Okay, but then there is also that interweaving of cognitive academic language opportunities into what the teacher educator was doing in class. And so we can then comfortably say that attention was being paid by this teacher educator to the fact that the pre-service teachers need to become proficient in the use of the language of teaching and learning. In addition to that, there is also this the 1022, and I'm going to read it very quickly. They were talking about half. How do you call this situation? And half. Okay, so then the teacher educator says, you see, a half is fraction. You see, a half in fraction work we teach the little ones. It's 1 out of 2 equal pieces, isn't it? So if I cut an apple into 2, half, that's it, right? In probability, this fraction is telling me more in English because it links to an activity, okay? So what is it telling you, right? What is the numerator telling me? So we see that in addition to infusing content and mathematics learning, mathematics language learning opportunities into what the teacher educator was doing, the teacher educator was also drawing on both the content and the interactional context to engage with how fraction is taught in the early grades. And so we can say there, thinking about the framework, that the teacher educator is paying attention to becoming, to the fact that the pre-service teachers are becoming teachers of mathematics. There's the teacherness here now. The teacher dimension is brought into the mix here. Okay, there is some other thing I did not mention, which I'm going to mention with this slide. Okay, so when we look at the transcript, the short transcript we have, we can see that becoming learners of mathematics content is there. The content is there, yes. Okay, becoming teachers of mathematics is there. Okay, but becoming learners of mathematical practices is not evident in the transcript. The teacher educator did not in a way engage with why he chose the example, how she chose the example, and in fact what makes for a good choice of example when teaching probability. So the structure of the example was not evident for the students to see. Okay, looking at becoming teachers of mathematics in multilingual classroom, this was another area where the teacher educator could have engaged more with, in terms of looking at that first question she asked in the transcript. So when they were doing tossing of coin, she asked, how do you call tossing of coin in your language? And the students were shouting the answers, and she said, anyway, let's continue. And so they continued the class. So that was a missed opportunity that could have been used to engage with the different ways in which the concept of tossing the coin is expressed in the different home languages that are present in the multilingual classroom, and how the reinterpretation or the deconstruction of those terms or those words in their home language could either enable enable learning or provide a hindrance to learning, because some languages use metaphors, and metaphors are not straightforward. Okay, so attention is being paid to becoming proficient users of the language of teaching and learning, we saw from the transcript. Okay, so when we look at this again, we can think of this in terms of, and I'm not in a way saying looking at the negatives in the teacher educator. I'm actually trying to show that with this framework, you can see what is attended to and what is not attended to. Okay, so in the framework that I've just passed now, you would see that the arrows are bidirectional. So, and in my analysis, I've used an inside-out approach. So where there is an object of learning and the object of learning moves to the different other things, So that is the inside-out approach. And I must say that the class was not a theory-driven class based on variation theory. So let's be clear about that. But we can also use an outside-in approach. Outside-in approach. So where the teacher educator decides in advance which layer of teacher education he or she needs to attend to at a particular point in time, and then decide on which interaction or process to use to give focus to this facet of teacher education. And then this will in turn inform the type of examples that the teacher can choose and use to bring out this particular focus. So thank you very much. Below there is the reference to the paper I was referring to, the ZDM paper. And what I must say about the paper is that it uses only two frameworks. It is a measure of two frameworks. But I feel that to really account for the complexity in teacher education, we need these three frameworks rather than the two frameworks I proposed in the ZDM paper. Thank you very much. I look forward to engaging with you at the conference.